Hello, thanks everyone. My name is Kath Albury. I'm a professor of media and communication at Swinburne University of Technology. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I live and work, the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my very deepest respects to elders past and present, and also extend that respect to all First Nations people participating in the webinar today. All right, so my panel is here to discuss the statement/provocation that digital media is fake and teaches young people all the wrong things about sexuality. Now, that's a provocation, but what is self-evidently true is that I'm not a young person. I'm 56 years old. But I have been researching practices of sexual self-representation in terms of sexuality and gender and identity since 1996. In my honours thesis and my PhD research, I looked at then contemporary practices of what was commonly called amateur pornography, or non-professional practices of producing and sharing Polaroid photographs, Super 8 films, and eventually home videos. We can perhaps talk about the amateur-professional divide later on in this conversation and why I think it's significant to this kind of debate. But what I will say, to make sure there's plenty of time for the panel, is that these pictures were produced and shared historically by people of all genders and sexualities. I was researching primarily Anglophone and European spaces like Australia, Canada, France, but this is a global practice. And these pictures were traditionally either kind of obviously posed in hotel room settings, or they were taken in domestic spaces like bedrooms or lounge rooms. Very occasionally, they were taken in a studio space. They were both still and moving images, and often they were clearly made to be shared with lovers, with friends, or with strangers. They were circulated through the mail, good old snail mail, often using anonymous post office boxes or drop boxes. Sometimes they were accompanied by written letters, and these textual accompaniments might be explicitly sexual. They might be shy. They might be quite fetishizing and racist or misogynistic or transphobic in the ways that we understand sexuality and gender and identity and power today. They could be deeply romantic, they could be silly, they could be playful, or they could be all of these things together. They were also published in niche publications or classifieds, often aimed at connecting people from sexual subcultures or minorities. Pictures and magazines were stored in shoeboxes under beds or in locked filing cabinets. The amateur pictures also populated mainstream readers' wives or homegirls sections of softcore heterosexual men's magazines. In Australia, they were called things like Picture and People, but they had different names in different countries back in the day. As I said, I was starting this research in the 1990s, and during that period, these older practices of mediated sexualities were shifting into digital spaces. They moved on to online forums and chat groups that blurred the erotic and the mundane, and eventually they appeared on social media platforms and mobile phones as nudes and selfies and sexts. And you no longer needed a Polaroid camera or a VCR or a desktop computer or a magazine subscription or a private mailbox to participate in mediated sexual cultures, because all these things were on your phone. As I say, I'm old and I've been researching this for a while. And I've had these conversations many times with journalists where I've asked them to consider, if we are saying, does digital media teach young people the wrong things in the wrong way about sex and sexuality and gender? What are the right ways to learn about sexuality, and where and how do we expect young people to access this knowledge? And then we might, if we're lucky, get into a conversation about families and culture and formal educational spaces and what these spaces do and don't teach young people, and where social media and other digital media practices fit into that bigger social contextual story. My three panelists today are really terrific young early career and emerging scholars who have conducted very careful, recent empirical research with high school aged and university aged young people, exploring exactly these questions about where social media and digital media practices fit into larger questions about sexual learning, social learning, and that question of authenticity and what aspects of sexuality do we consider to be real or fake. I am delighted to have Sam, Mannix, Barrie, Shannon, and Zheng joining me today. I'm going to begin by asking Dr. Samantha Mannix to introduce her research first up. Samantha, what does your research look at, and what are your key findings and takeaways from that work, please?
Take myself off mute, always a good start. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kath. So my PhD research looked at how young people, predominantly those aged 14 to 16, come to understand and experience intimate dating, romantic relationships. So a key aim of my research was to really gain a greater understanding of young people's lived experiences from a vantage point that kind of moved away from notions of risk and deficit, but opened up questions around, youthful agency, capacity, and desires. One of my key findings in regards to learning, and most relevant to our conversations today, was around the role of digital spaces, practices, and cultures. This was particularly important in the context of what my participants described as inadequate and heteronormative formal school curriculum related to relationships and sexuality, which I'm sure Barrie will touch on more. So they spoke about the ways they learned through engaging in digital cultures in Tumblr, for example, but also through the social media practices of their friends. So the way that their friends posted photos of their partners, the way that their friends posted anniversary posts, and commenting on each other's posts and things like that. So this learning was playful, sometimes silly, sometimes hurtful, sometimes incredibly critical. While some participants questioned the authenticity of these kinds of practices and also described really nuanced rules for understanding and gauging this authenticity, they also described the very real care and love they received through this participation, or through engaging in observing. So while not all participants posted photos of their partner online, for example, they did participate daily in seeing kind of social media feeds of these relationships. And my findings suggested that participation in these practices really helped or really shaped norms for what a relationship looks like, and sometimes in ways that transgress gender norms, while other times re-articulating old gender binaries and heterosexual privileges. I'll stop there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So many things to think about and talk about already. I'd like to invite Dr. Barrie, Shannon, please, to share your research. Can you tell us what you have been looking at in your work, and what your key findings were in relation to these questions around what social media teaches young people about sexuality?
Absolutely. Can I just say I'm really glad to be here and speaking on a panel alongside a bunch of academics whose work I've used pretty extensively and who I admire. So this is really great. My research looks at sexuality education for trans and gender diverse young people. And I'm really interested in how these young people understand and perceive the lessons that are offered at school, but more so how their day-to-day engagement with media and digital cultures constitute a sort of informal education on sexuality, but also an education on civics, things like identity, belonging, diversity, discussions about homophobia and transphobia, the sort of sentiments that are usually lumped in with the idea of sexuality education. The key findings and takeaways of my research are that trans youth want their schools to be better at providing this education to them, obviously, but that they don't consider them a reliable or a particularly relevant source of information about sex, sexuality, and gender. More compelling to those young people are the opportunities that are available to them in networked publics to learn from experts, really, in being trans, other young people. Most of my participants talked about viewing transition timelines on YouTube, for example, following queer users on Tumblr, being members of queer Facebook groups, all sort of environments where online content posted and shared by other young people became a sort of curriculum, I guess, on gender, sexuality, history, art, politics, and all sorts. Things that are, way beyond the scope of what can go on in a health and physical education class. So naturally, those experiences for my participants were better than those that were available at school. And in many cases, and I think this is the most important part, were kind of fundamentally transformative for them. They were vitally important in how they were able to develop as queer young people. So kind of putting positive and negative framing of class content aside for a second, school-based sex education isn't really offering queer young people or any young people really an induction into sexuality as a lived experience, what it means to be in our society where sexual norms, practices, and cultures fundamentally shape our lifestyles for better or for worse. Another one of my key findings is that while digital environments were reliable sources of information and community for queer youth, the areas of the school curriculum that did resonate and that were helpful were usually social studies and especially English. Exploring queerness through analysing films and books was much more affirming than learning about the concept of a gay person or why homophobia is wrong in their health classes. So there's more to sexuality, identity, and belonging than our sexual health. So my research currently and going forward is going to examine, I guess, the pedagogical characteristics of networked publics and how schools and teachers can complement these learnings that young people are kind of undertaking autonomously rather than try to hide them away or compete with them and create this dichotomy where the stuff they learn at school is good and stuff they learn online is bad or potentially dangerous.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'd love to come back later on to think about those different forms of textual learning that you've talked about there, what we learn or how we come to our identities through books or through films or through other texts. I'd like to move on then to hear from Zheng, who is close to submitting a PhD at Deakin University. Can you please tell us about your research, about what your key findings or your takeaways to date have been and how you've explored these questions of how young people are learning through digital media or social media practices?
Thank you, Kath. It's such a pleasure to be here and see Sam and Barrie. Hi from Melbourne. So my PhD explores Chinese queer female students' queer and adult identity making in Australia. This study sits at the intersection of queer youth and mobility migration studies. And I'm here today because digital media has always been a significant element in my research design, in my research focus, and as well findings. When I was a baby researcher, aka in my honors year, I examined Chinese lesbians' double marginalization in the digital era. And my current research project employed the social media scrollback method in interviews. The findings also show that digital media has been profoundly influencing, shaping, and facilitating these students' transnational identity making in many nuanced ways. So Chinese queer female students' process of crafting their queer and adult identity is quite non-linear and uneven, often complicating the conventional paradigms of youth transitions with all these remarkable milestones. And they even challenge the previous conceptualization of queer temporality in dominantly the US context. The strong sense of uncertainty often challenges different aspects of our understanding of norms in these young people's life, and including their use of digital media. So drawing on prior literature, how do these people use digital media for what purposes? It might be for placemaking. It might be for exploring a new culture, which they are not familiar with in the past. It also can be something they use to seek belonging and community to connect with other people. But in my study, I found that they use this maybe for a personal refuge when they feel emotionally breakdown, or they might use that for hyperlink storage, for memories and personal archives. They also might use this to stay connected with their family, even in some way they're not really likely to do that, but they somehow have to do that because of the cultural and obligation in their family roles. So that's just a really small overview of my study, especially on digital media.
Great, thank you so much. So I've begun to think about the ways that people are using social media now. And we've heard about the empirical research that all three of you are working on. This session or this series of sessions really is thinking about the ways that history repeats, but the ways that it also shifts and changes. So I'd like to go back to each of you, starting with Samantha, and ask you to contextualize some of the work you're doing. What are the historical concerns that your research is speaking to or building on? What is the context for your work? And this could be an academic debate, it could be a public controversy, or it could be something else entirely. Can you tell me, Samantha, what's the context your work sits into in your mind?
Sure. So I come from a public health background, particularly working in the prevention of gender-based violence and sexual health areas. And here we're frequently considering young people in terms of risk, at risk of violence, at risk of STIs. And so interventions are thus kind of directed towards preventing STIs and preventing violence. Well, obviously this framing is often warranted. I kind of entered into my PhD under the, as a former young person, thinking this doesn't really capture all experiences, all desires and identities. However, like what I think is really important to kind of note today is that the digital media did not create these risks. For example, gendered violence and harassment has always occurred in young people's relationships. The concerns with the digital has come to kind of dominate these discussions now moving forward. And as I said, this is often warranted. However, the mechanisms that underpin the perpetration of these violences, such as gendered and racial power, have remained the same. Similarly, young people's sexualities have always been positioned as risky, some more than others. And that's kind of the space that I entered into. And I think kind of just drawing really quickly on my empirical work here is that my participants spoke of the frustrations they had with adults consistently dismissing their relationships as fake or not important, and the kind of impact that had on their experiences of some of these risks, their experiences of some of the benefits and things like that. So I think I would add that into where I entered into this space.
Great, thank you. Barrie, what are the histories or the debates that you think your work is responding to or in dialogue with?
Well, in terms of my research on sexuality education, I guess the main concern that it deals with relates to that sort of almost identical and cyclical moral panic about youth sexuality and schooling that seems to have repeated over and over again since like the 50s. I had I don't know if you'd call it a pleasure, but I had the pleasure of reading some truly wild sex education booklets that were made for young people in the 50s, and the way they sort of talked about the inherent risks of sexuality, and especially of homosexuality, was, let's just say, it was a lot more pronounced than perhaps today's moral panics were, but they still have those some kind of fundamental tenets to them. So from those moral panics through to the moral panics about gay teachers and sex education in the 60s, to sex education panics in the 90s and 2000s. Panic over the Share program was here in South Australia, is one that I've written about before, to safe schools, to the Welcome to Sex book that was the subject of a moral panic earlier this year, to Elon Musk's so-called woke mind virus. I mean, the characteristics of these moral panics are sort of identical. It's all about young, impressionable children who are being corrupted and victimized by this sort of nebulous, evil Marxist intelligentsia, which is basically just short code for gay people. So I guess my research responds to this and asks how we can make progress on a comprehensive sexuality education, one that examines sex and the body, sexuality, pleasure, erotics, diversity, civics, and belonging. I will ask if this is even possible in a school, in a political environment that hasn't changed really for decades. These sort of moral panics aren't new. They just kind of keep repeating. But even though each of them have different actors, different focal points, and are ignited over different political issues, under the facade, they're pretty much the same. But especially in terms of digital publics as well, I guess my research grapples with the troubles of acknowledging the ways that young people's sexualities, A, exist, and B, are mediated by technologies. And I guess acknowledging social media platforms as comprehensive sex educators, and what that might mean for schools and teachers to relinquish some of that authority in terms of determining what is the truth about sex and sexuality, and perhaps taking a more supporting role in fostering sexual and digital literacies, rather than being that kind of moral authority on sex, sexuality, and sexual practices.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. How can you tell us a bit about the historical or political contexts and debates that underpin your work? What are some of the foundations that you are speaking to or talking with or responding, I guess, speaking back to in different ways?
Yes, as a researcher, studied digital media in a Chinese context, proposition I've been engaged with, it's like Chinese digital media provided a really bad or at least unfriendly environment for young people to explore their sexuality, especially for queer young people. And I think my idea or my view can be quite similar to what Jia just mentioned in the last panel, but I'm speaking from more like a user's perspective here. I think I myself have encountered so many troubles with this quite unfriendly environment. I had a study, like an account I studied in my honors year got banned like a few weeks before I submitted my thesis. And one of my participants' account once got suspended because she reposted something related to a feminist movement in China. So I have a lot of experiences with that, but I think it can be a quite problematic proposition when media or like newspapers or other scholars asking questions beyond building on this proposition. it's quite easy to say like, yes, this is being censored or this is being scrutinized by the authority, but how do we study them in a more diverse and expansive and also productive way to understand the complexity behind this quite not easy to understand digital media use in that environment can be another, I think, challenging question to ask. Yeah.
Thank you. And I really appreciate how the way you've brought in that kind of different sense of whether or not digital media is fake, where we think about digital media perhaps as a realm that is being overly surveilled or sanitized. And so speech or self-representation on that space, it becomes suspect, and maybe a side of self-censorship as well as a sense of performance in the sense in which social media is often talked about fake in relation to Australian young people's sexuality and relationships. So thank you for bringing us that different kind of dimension, for thinking about how social media might work and why people might accuse it of being fake. I'd now like to ask each of my panelists to share what you think the debates that you are engaging with or speaking back to, or the frustrating questions that sparked your research in the first place. What do they get wrong about young people, about sexuality, and about this question about whether digital cultures are real or fake, and all the implications that those questions might have? Sam, again, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I guess my first reaction is like, so what? So what if they're fake? I think all of us spoken to the different productive ways that young people engage in digital cultures, and Barrie's context of school-based formal education kind of neglecting so many important things related to sexuality. And for my participants, relationships at all, the only time we talked about a relationship was in not having sex, for example. So I really think it overlooks the potential of fake as a space to learn, to try on different things. For my participants, that was very much about, posting a photo and seeing how many likes it gets. Is this what it looks like to be in a relationship? For others, it was, posting, is it me and my boyfriend doing stereotypically heterosexual things and putting it up online? Is it me thinking, oh, my friend's doing those things don't ring quite true to me, maybe because of the gendered stereotypical things that they're doing. And that's kind of testing those ideas around what it might look like to be in a relationship, what it might look like or feel like to be in a relationship. So I think, whether adults decide this is real or not is besides the point. It's a space for young people to test boundaries, test out ideas related to their desires and their sexualities and their genders. And as Barrie said, and I think, Kath, you've written about, Paul Byron calls the digital cultures of care. And these are these informal spaces where young people are really kind of participating in digital cultures, shifting norms of digital cultures. And that doesn't just end when they turn their computer off or close the phone. These are kind of, it's real life, I guess is what I'm trying to say, without trying to fall into that binary. I think it also dictates what real connection looks like. If we don't think of online spaces as generating real generative, affective feelings, then we're missing, quite frankly, it's ableist, but we're also missing a lot of potential there. If posting about a fun time with your girlfriend makes you feel good, and is a way of showing that you care and sharing that with your friends in a way that also subverts adult conceptions and restrictions, why is this fake? I think finally, if I go back to like these ideas of being concerned with risk, if we're always constantly dismissing what happens online as being fake, what does that mean, for example, experience of sexual harassment or gendered harassment? Do we think that's fake too? And for my participants in my research, I think that had very real repercussions. So if we are kind of always constantly dismissing the online as being something that is not real, then we miss the potential to support people who've experienced violence, or to call violence what it is.
Thank you so much. And yes, it's really, I think, a great point to remember the ways that the experiences of feeling, of emotion, of safety, of feeling unsafe kind of flow through these digital cultures in such deep ways, and what the impacts are if we do dismiss them or minimize them. Barrie, can I ask you to share what you think the debates that you've engaged with get wrong about young people and sexuality and digital culture?
Of course. On what they get wrong, I guess first and foremost about the moral panics about sexuality and sex education. They kind of engage in this pure fantasy that young people don't experience sexuality. And if they do, it's naturally heterosexual and gender conforming until they're shaped otherwise by external forces. So it kind of rehashes this idea that gayness and transness, especially nowadays, can be transmitted through social contagion, through corrupt elites, through their shaping of the education system, or anonymous bad actors online. So in this way, those are straightforwardly homophobic and transphobic projects. And I think it's important to call them what they are. In my view on the debates about sexuality education and informal education within digital platforms, I think the debates around whether they're suitable or not, or whether they're fake or not, perpetuate the view that schools are automatically and always the best possible place for this sort of education to take place, which I think is wrong. And my research with young people and on their engagement with networked publics would suggest almost the opposite of that, that schools are kind of really struggling to keep up with not just the information that's available online, but just the aspects of how sexuality is mediated by digital technology, and how digital spaces allow for that being, as I put it earlier, that isn't available at school, or really any student, but especially queer students. I think that separating sex and technology is no longer possible, even though I think that's kind of what schools tend to try to do. And prominent discourses on young people, sex, and the internet seem to create this binary in which face-to-face, I guess, corporeal sexuality is traditional, natural, and therefore potentially good, and technology-mediated sexuality is unnatural, immoral, and dangerous, like a private sort of deviant frivolity that doesn't deserve to take up that space of legitimacy. On whether they're fake, to reiterate what I said before about my participants' experiences using network publics for sexuality education, I mean, those were really transformative experiences that were sort of fundamental to having a sense of self. I think of one of my participants who talked about how they learnt terminology about different genders and sexualities on Tumblr, and how that sort of really recontextualized all of their past experiences. They talked about how they had this fixation on Pink when they were, like the singer Pink, back when they were younger, and then learnt about all this technology, these terminologies about sexuality and gender, came to understand themselves as queer and non-binary, and realized, oh, I had a crush on Pink this whole time. I wasn't just super into her music. So yeah, I don't know how you could describe that as fake unless you had something, a specific agenda to say about the young people and youth more generally, and how they spend their time and use the internet.
Thank you so much. How can I ask you, please, to tell us about what you think, in your expert opinion, the debates or the historical conflicts that you are engaging with in your work have gotten wrong around young people and sexuality? And I know you're working with university-aged young people, not school-aged young people. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and also what is wrong with the question of whether digital cultures are real or fake, if there is something wrong with that question.
Thank you, Kath. I'd like to share a common question I like often receive when I share my work in like at conferences. Is like, why my participants, Chinese queer female students, stay on Chinese digital media platform? Why don't they just migrate to like a platform, for example, like Tumblr or Instagram when they're here in Australia, where they can be, you know, more real as themselves? So this is definitely not a wrong question. Actually, it's a really critical and good question, and it allowed me to have more time to unpack the complexity behind their digital media use and in a Q&A beyond my presentation. But I think it's very hard to give an answer to explain the why. And I think if you throw the same question to the participants, to the students themselves, they cannot maybe, you know, try to explain why they stay. But rather than providing an answer, I might just share like a scenario. It's like, on one hand, you have this new platform, which maybe can be more you have more freedom to express your sexuality. You can post more exposed picture of yourself, and you can talk to people in more implicit language. But it's in a language you are struggling to speak, and you have never used this platform before you came here. It might be just 2 months ago. And on the other hand, you have another platform you have been used since you were 12, and then you use that every single day. It has all the silly pictures of yourself since maybe primary school, and it's in your language, which you speak every day. So in that scenario, which one would make you feel more real and more comfortable and safe? So it's very hard to unpack that question and give a direct answer. But I think as researchers, we should understand this is a polymedia environment. The users are making moral decisions for if and how they use every single different platform. And so I think when it talks to fake or real, we should understand more about the rationale and the evidence our participants shared with us, but not only determine it's good or it's bad, it's real or it's fake by us. Just let their story speak.
Thank you so much. I have a question I'd like to share with each of the panelists, a question from the audience, and I will remind the audience you are very welcome to ask us questions too. There's a question of how each of you, if you can share, how do you think restrictive social media policies around sex, especially concerning images of nudity, or it could also be explicit kinds of language, as Hal has said, how does this complicate the agentic potential of social media as a context for sexual learning? I might start with you, Hal, and then I'll work back to Sam this time.
Thank you for Emily's question. Good to see you here. My answer to this question can be quite just top from my head. Like, I haven't really think about this in depth, but considering what I just talked about, the nudity and even like really explicit language in a Chinese context can be quite challenging. And people who would like to pursue this kind of conversation would need to go through some self-censorship in firsthand. Like how do they express it in a safe way and not get, seek attention from the platform or the authority to keep an eye on them. So I knew some educational, like sex educational channel and account who do talk about some explicit topic, but nothing to do with the image. More, it's about the content, and they do seek a lot of way to navigate how they can express this through maybe picture, very subtle. It's very hard to understand if you're not in that context and you don't have some like background knowledge, and somehow they have to direct you to a more secure or private link to show you some content which might get them into trouble. So I would say they need more thorough and in-depth thinking before they share the content in relation to sexuality. And as I know, most of the readers, the audience of this account and channels can be young people. So the target audience would be like 18 to 25, something like that. So that's just my primary response to Emily's question. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Sam, how do you think restrictive policies might complicate the potential for sexual learning and also, I guess, social learning in digital culture?
I guess we have had some insight into this with Tumblr. And, you know, that was definitely a place that my queer participants turned to for this kind of, and the same thing as Barrie mentioned, you know, like finding out the language to describe how they were feeling about things and that kind of thing. But I guess for me, I would be really curious to see the ways that young people themselves are navigating these policies and what are the workarounds they're finding. And, you know, Hal touched on that as well, thinking about those kind of cultures where what are the sort of stand-ins for sex? What are the stand-in languages that we use to ask these questions? And I think that comes through already in social media. But also it's not only about sex, I think. And young people in my research were kind of constantly saying to me, it's not only about sex, it's not only about sex. We want to know about you know, relationships. We want to know about how to express our gender in a relationship and all those kinds of things. So I think it would be, I'm curious to understand how young people themselves experience that. But beyond that, I'm not too sure.
Right, thank you. Barrie, do you have any thoughts on how the platform policy impacts expression of sexuality or engagement with sexuality in digital culture?
Yeah, I kind of just want to mirror what Sam was just saying as well. So interesting, the participants were talking about how it's really not just about sex. And I think the same thing is true in what I want to say about Tumblr, especially. My participants virtually all talked about Tumblr, but none of them shared with me that they used Tumblr for porn or for posting sexy selfies or anything like that, even though I'm sure some of them probably did. But that they use Tumblr to engage in queer erotics and cultures in a different sort of way through fan fiction, through posting about their favorite shows and shipping characters or, you know, shipping members of One Direction or whatever it happened to be. So I think that the kind of top-down imposition of, I guess, censorship of sexuality, whether it's explicit or not, might not affect all users in the same way. But I think perhaps it has the function of kind of killing the vibe. It's like suddenly there was a party going on where people were able to freely express themselves, and now the parents are kind of chaperoning and watching what you do, and perhaps feeling that surveillance and feeling that pressure, and feeling, I guess, critiqued from above like that could perhaps serve to, you know, change the vibe of the platform. There's been a lot of debate about whether Tumblr's dead or not. But if it's not dead, it's definitely different to what it was, I think, before the porn ban. And you can kind of see that play out. I remember a couple of years ago now, Tumblr tweeted about being the queerest place on the internet. And underneath that, they were just getting rinsed by Tumblr users, like hundreds of them being like, really, you banned female presenting nipples from your platform and you think you're the queerest place on the internet. So yeah, I mean, that's what I think about it. Maybe not the explicit sexuality that gets censored maybe affects the users, but it's the kind of flow-on effects of what kind of environment it creates.
Great, thank you. And I wish I had the quote on the tip of my tongue, but sometimes these conversations remind me of Michel Foucault's old quip about, you know, it's not the thing that people are worried about in gay men's relationships is not so much that they're having sex, but it's the quality of friendship and the quality of intimacy, and there are elements, I think, that everyone has touched on the ways that social media suppression of what is considered to be a sexual image has a really strong and sometimes oppressive influence on sociality. And I don't think that there's necessarily a recognition of this when, yes, the nude is discussed as a kind of individual or dyadic practice as opposed to a broader social practice. And the nude's just an example. It could be all kinds of sexual self-representation or self-expression. This is a question for anyone, although I think How's participants might have much to say about this. We'll see how, if you think this is a question particularly for you and the young women that you were speaking to, but there's a question about long distance relationship and formation and the ways this happens in digital space. Have any of you had a chance to understand or discover patterns or in social media practices in long distance relationship? And that could be things like maintaining a relationship through exchange of nudes or, spicy chat. And how have these activities changed over time, if they have? How is that something that you talked about in your research?
Not specifically, but I think it's a really interesting topic, and I'd love to delve into it. So I can just recall like one participant shares so many screenshots with me when I did my social media scrollback interviews with her, and her girlfriend was in China and they have never met each other. So it was long distance in the first place, and it's really interesting to observe how they communicate with each other. So interestingly, there's no really like spicy content involved when we talk about her relationship. She shared with me it's all these mundane posts about how she talked to her girlfriend, and they share like really small things like, what's the weather today? The moon today is really full. They enjoy watching TV together. All these specific details and moments they share together via digital media, and they try to capture all these sweet moments through posting it on social media platforms. And interestingly, as I just try to think about if there's anything related to their sexual conversation or chats, there's zero I can recall. I think it's quite interesting because maybe sometimes when we interview people, it's something about they don't say, or it's more than what they say. So it can be one thing is like they're not like this, my participant is not quite comfortable in talking to me about her sexual life. Or other things is maybe it's not that critical to her when she tries to frame and give a narrative about her relationship. So she maybe value more about all these significant but mundane moments in her relationship. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I think for me, in kind of thinking about the histories of digital cultures and sexualized digital cultures, that continual moving back and forth between what's considered to be sexually explicit and what is considered to be mundane, and where intimacy weaves through those two spaces is an interesting question that recurs again and again. And I think it's one of the questions that I love to return to, as opposed to these "is it real, is it fake" questions. I wonder if I can ask each of the panelists what questions you like to come back to, what questions really matter to you in this space, and what do you think we need to keep asking or ask in different ways. Samantha, can I begin with you?
Someone's just started cutting down bushes out the window, so apologies for the timing. I guess, again, for me, it is always coming back to young people's perspectives on these kind of debates, issues, and I think it's also interesting to understand what we can learn from how they engage in these debates themselves. I think, media scholars have for a long time been trying to dismiss that binary between online real and offline fake, and young people themselves are in the process of understanding what that means, and whether it, you know, how they kind of trouble that, which is often dictated by the adults in their lives kind of framing things in a different way. So I'm curious around like how they understand and engage with notions of authenticity. And then, you know, what norms do we rely upon as adults to make calls about what's fake for young people, and what are the repercussions of this, and why is it an important distinction, and how, I guess, young people are shifting and shaping these norms. So that would be my spin on kind of, I guess, responding to this provocation, is to talk to young people more about how they're experiencing these things. And thinking about, you know, how it is not always as clear cut as it's made out to be.
Thank you. Look, I have an additional provocative question that I'm going to ask each of you as a follow-up to this one that's just slid into my DMs. Who is the young person we're talking about? There's, you know, when we think of moral panics and appeals to protect young people, there's often a very specific model of the young person that we're talking about. Who are we imagining the young person is, and how relevant or useful is that conception to you?
You want me to follow on from that? Yeah. Yeah, so the young person we're often talking about in that context, well, in my research and the literature I've engaged with, is a straight white young woman. And are protectionist discourses useful in that context? Absolutely not. Because often the context we respond to that is don't send nudes, or don't go online, or don't have sex. And that's kind of a historical conversation we've been in since, you know, forever. And feminists, queer theorists, scholars of color have been trying to interrupt that debate, because on the other flip side of that, we have those who are more frequently positioned as being risky or sexualized, as Barrie mentioned earlier, gay men, Black women. So I would suggest that this kind of idea of a singular young person that needs to be kind of protected from fake of social media is non-existent. And identities are kind of shifting, and just because I'm posting on social media with my boyfriend one day doesn't mean I'm not posting with my girlfriend the next day. So it's a very dynamic space, I guess. I'll let the other two answer more.
That's a good answer, and we can't hear the tree loppers, don't worry. Barrie, can I ask you to share what questions you think we should be asking? If the questions we've been asked again and again are wrong, what should we be asking? And also, who is this young person who's learning the wrong things?
Similar to Sam, I think that the most important question we need to ask is, what do young queer people themselves think and feel about their education? What they see as being education, what they see as being leisure, rather than us creating that distinction for them. And I guess asking how they supplement their sexuality and civics education, or as it relates to my research specifically, via their participation in digital cultures. Yeah, I think the status quo on education and digital literacy, sex education, drug education, and any other kind of civics education kind of stubbornly clings to this moral framework that's would have claimed to be self-evident, that sex and sexuality are dangerous or taboo, that young people are inherently irresponsible or corruptible, and that access to information about these sort of issues is best dealt by appointed authorities within the school environment. And I think that it's, we acknowledge that adults decide on and enact that framing with virtually no input from young people. So the question is, where are the young people's voices in that? I think going beyond schools, we should probably start asking what schools can do well in regards to sexuality and civics education, rather than just dunking on them all the time and saying that they're bad. And perhaps what they might be better off supporting young people to do in terms of facilitating them and preparing them for constructive and positive experiences in their lives outside of school, which is kind of the stated objective of most sex education curricula anyway. And thinking about how that could best be achieved, again, whether it be through things like social studies or English or digital literacies, to sort of touch on those subjects that don't fit well in the health curriculum and therefore don't really get talked about. If I could offer my opinion on networked sexualized moral panics in a broad general sense, I think it's probably useful that we start asking who is panicking and for what reason, rather than just, I guess, responding to the fact that there is a panic. And if we take the Welcome to Sex book as an example, the panic around that, while short-lived, was really highly orchestrated and organized by a group, or by groups of people that really favor that direct action as a political strategy, including, turning up to a big W and accusing the retail workers of selling porn to minors. I mean, it's sensational, it's attention grabbing, but at the end of the day, it's sort of a really small group of people organizing for a specific response out of people. So I think that perhaps it's worth thinking and asking questions about that. In regard to your question on who is the young person, again, similar to Sam, the young people, the prototypical young people in the research I do are heterosexual, gender conforming, and I guess loyal to all of those social institutions that shape what a good sexual citizen is, the family, the nation state. And that prototypical young person is a subject of desire for corruption by bad actors, hence the, I guess, panic about their well-being.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Hal, can you please share, in your opinion, what are the questions that we should be asking about young people and digital culture and sexuality? And in the questions that you might be asking, who are young people? Is there a young person that stands outside these moral panics, and who might that young person be?
So to answer the first question, there are two things I'd like to mention. Things I already said, like something is bad, it's not a really helpful proposition. What is the helpful one? For me, I think the focus on functionality and affordances can be a good and productive way to study digital cultures. For me, it's a way to address the limitation each platform has, and also to focus on the complexity, like what's the tangling things behind their maybe they're not even pattern, like their use of digital media. And it just help us to unpack the messiness of digital cultures in a more expansive and relational way. And the other thing I'd like to mention is the methodology. I think the thing we always think about is how do we create knowledge about digital media, which is always changing and different to each person, and how can we do it ethically? So I really endorse what Stephanie Dugre's sentiment in her article. It's the TikTok's queer potential, which I really like. And I think we must approach the messiness of digital cultures, especially among mobile young people, mobile queer young people, with care and respect and patience. As researchers, it's our duty to kind of listen to their stories, and maybe sometimes it can be confounding in the first place, and to unravel the complexity and convey that to a broader audience. I think that's what I try to do, and I really hope more research coming up through this approach as well. And to answer the second question about who are these young people are, like in my research, my study, the participants of my study are Chinese queer female students or graduates aged from 20 to 34. So it's like, it's such a age span there. And they were from the PRC, so they were born in mainland China, and they migrated or like arrived in Australia after they were 13. So this was like the screening criteria I set for my research. So comparatively, they might be older when we compared to what our understanding of young people. But I would say expansively, they are just young people who are trying to figure out their way, figure out who they are. And compared to the expectations set by their family and by society, they are so immature in their family's eyes and maybe in public's eyes in Chinese culture. So they're still quite young in that way. And this is definitely a relational definition of youth and young people.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you to Samantha Mannix, to Barrie, Shannon, to Zheng, for an incredibly rich, complex, and, as you say, a very ethical reflection on the provocation that digital media is fake and teaches young people the wrong things about sexuality. I learned so much, and I'm very grateful to all of you for joining me today. Thank you. I'd like to now hand over to Dr. Natalie Hendry, who will be hosting the next panel in this great day of back-to-back roundtables, speaking next about social media and mental health.